$15 was the price of a hunting dog with good bloodlines. It was not supposed to be the price of a woman. The wind came down off the Bitterhorn Range like it had a grudge against Larkspur Hollow, rattling the tin roof of Tolliver's trading post hard enough to make the lanterns swing on their hooks. Nathaniel Kessler stood near the door, with his collar up and his hat pulled low, waiting on a sack of cornmeal and a spool of wire, wanting nothing to do with the noise and the crowd pressed in around the stove. He had learned, over 11 winters alone on the ridge, that a room full of desperate men was its own weather system, and the smart thing was to keep to the edges of it. He was not a man who looked for trouble. He was a man trouble had to go out of its way to find. It found him anyway, the way it always seemed to. The shouting started near the counter, over by the ledger, where Garrison Tolliver kept his accounts and his grudges in the same crabbed handwriting. Garrison was heavyset, in the way of a man who ate well while everyone around him went hungry, with small eyes set too close together and a voice that carried like a dropped kettle. $15, Garrison was saying, loud enough for the whole store to hear, like he was announcing the price of flour. 15 and she's yours to work. Cooks, cleans, don't talk back. Not anymore, anyhow. Nathaniel didn't turn at first, the frontier-bred men who could look straight through a thing and call it nothing, if looking at it honestly would cost them too much. He had gotten good at that particular blindness. It was the only way to keep a conscience intact out here without it killing you. Then he heard the silence underneath the shouting, and that was what turned his head. There was a girl kneeling on the floorboards beside the counter, one of Garrison's hands fisted in the collar of her dress like she was livestock he was steadying. She did not struggle. She did not cry out. She simply knelt there with her chin tucked and her eyes fixed on some middle distance past the toe of her own boot, as though she had already left the room in every way that mattered, and only her body remained behind to be sold. Her name, Nathaniel would learn later, was Iris Calder, though in that moment she was nothing to him but a shape on the floor and a stillness that didn't belong in a room full of shouting men. She looked young, younger than the hollows under her eyes suggested, older than the dirt on her face let her seem. Her dress had been a good one once, a soft blue gone gray with wear, the hem torn and restitched crooked by a hand that had been in a hurry, or in pain, or both. Her wrists, where they showed past her cuffs, carried the yellow-green shadow of bruises weeks old laid over bruises days old, like tree rings marking a hard season. "She's quiet," Garrison said to the room, hauling her up by the collar so she stumbled to her feet. "Quiet's a virtue in a woman, I always say." 8. Through the last of what her daddy left when he passed. And I ain't running a charity. $15, and I throw in the mule cart she come in on. A miner near the stove laughed, low and ugly. Someone else said something about virtues that made a few men chuckle and made Nathaniel's jaw go tight enough to ache. He should not have looked at her face. That was his mistake, if a person could call it that. He looked, and her eyes came up off the floor for just a second, pale hazel, ringed dark with exhaustion and entirely unnervingly calm. Not pleading, not afraid, not in any way he recognized. She was doing arithmetic. He could see it plain as a ledger. She was counting the men in the room, measuring the door, calculating which version of this evening cost her the least. That stillness was the thing that undid him. A woman fighting he could have walked past. Fighting meant there was still someone left in there to save herself. This was a woman who had already stopped fighting, because fighting had never once worked. Nathaniel set down the sack of cornmeal. He did not remember deciding to cross the room. His boots simply carried him there, past the stove, past the men who parted for him the way men on the frontier learned to part for anyone built the way he was built. 6'3" of scarred, silent trouble in a buffalo hide coat, a man folks called Kessler and did not ask questions of. He stopped in front of Garrison Tolliver and reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and his fingers found the fold of bills he'd been saving 3 months to put toward a second horse. He didn't count it out politely. He pulled it free and let it fall, and it landed in the sawdust between Garrison's boots. A 10, a 5, soft as a whisper and twice as final. The room went quiet enough to hear the stove ticking. Garrison looked down at the money, then up at Nathaniel's face, and whatever he saw there made him decide against negotiating. He let go of her collar like it had gone hot in his hand. "Pleasure doing business," Garrison said, already crouching to gather the bills, all the bluster gone reedy and small. Nathaniel didn't answer him. He didn't look at the miners by the stove, or the shopkeep's wife pretending not to watch from behind the flour barrels. He reached out and closed his hand, gently as he knew how, around the girl's wrist, the one without bruises, and said the only word he had in him. "Come." She came. Not gratefully, not the way a rescued thing was supposed to come, with relief pouring off her like heat off a stove. She came the way a person walks toward an uncertain fate, because the alternative is worse. Her spine straight, her face a mask, and something in Nathaniel's chest cracked a little at the sight of it, though he could not have said, right then, exactly why. Outside, the wind hit them broadside, and Iris flinched. The first real reaction he'd gotten out of her. A small human flinch against the cold that made her look for one unguarded second like exactly what she was, a girl of maybe 22, freezing and entirely alone in the world. His horse, a raw-boned bay gelding named Ash, stood hitched to the post with his ears pinned back against the wind. Nathaniel didn't ask permission. He lifted her. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of cold bones under too little dress, and set her up on the saddle, then swung up behind her and drew the front of his coat around them both. She went rigid against him, every muscle locked, enduring his warmth rather than accepting it, and he understood that too. Warmth from a man had probably never once, in her whole life, come free. They rode up into the hills in silence, the trail narrowing to a dark seam between black pines, snow starting to needle down, out of a sky the color of a healing bruise. The cabin sat where the ridge folded in on itself, half built into the mountainside, its chimney breathing a thin gray thread into the evening. By the time they reached it, full dark had come down, and Iris's teeth were chattering hard enough that Nathaniel could feel it through his own ribs. He got her down, got her inside, got the fire going with the efficient, wordless economy of a man who had done everything alone. For so long he'd forgotten there was another way. She stood just inside the door and dripped onto his floorboards and watched him with those pale, calculating eyes, tracking his hands the way a person tracks a snake they aren't sure is done striking. "There's a blanket on the peg," he said, not looking at her, because looking at her felt like an intrusion. "Wrap up." She took the blanket. She did not wrap it around herself. She held it against her chest like a shield, and stood there while he filled the kettle and cut 2 strips of dried venison and set them on the table, and said the only other word he had for the evening, eat. She ate like something starved, which she was, tearing into the meat with a speed that had nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with the certainty, worn into her by God knew what. That food offered was food that could be taken back at any moment, so a person had better get it down fast. It was hard to watch. Nathaniel turned his back to the fire and gave her that mercy at least. "What's your name?" he asked the flames. "Iris," she said. Her voice was low and rough, unused. Iris called her Kessler, he said. Nathaniel Kessler. The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular silence of 2 strangers standing in the wreckage of an arrangement neither of them had chosen. Outside, the wind kept working at the eaves like it wanted in. He was thinking about where she'd sleep. The bed, narrow as it was, seemed the only decent option, and he'd take the floor. When he heard the rustle of the blanket dropping, he turned. Iris stood by the table with the wool pooled around her feet, and her hands had gone to the laces of what remained of her dress. She was not doing it slowly or seductively or with any performance in it at all. She was undoing the laces the way a person unpacks a bag they've been told to unpack, briskly, without feeling, because feeling was a luxury that had been trained out of her a long time ago. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel said, and it came out rougher than he meant. She stopped, dress half open, and looked at him with a face gone smooth and unreadable as a held breath. "I know how this goes," she said. "I'd rather know now than guess." "When you're finished, do you want me quiet after, or do you want to talk?" "My uncle liked me quiet. The man before him liked me to say his name." The words landed in Nathaniel's chest like a dropped stone, cold and heavy and sinking. He felt something in him go very still, the way the woods go still right before a bad storm breaks. "Cover yourself," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, betraying him. She did not move to cover herself. Instead, her chin came up, and for the first time he saw something under the flatness. Not fear exactly, but a bracing. The look of a person setting her feet before a blow she has decided is inevitable and is determined to take without falling. "I don't want anything from you tonight but a locked door and a fire that stays lit," Nathaniel said, forcing the words out slow, and even though his hands at his sides were not steady. "Not that. Not ever. Unless a day comes when you want it too, and I don't expect that day, and I'm not waiting on it. You understand me?" Iris stared at him. He watched her search his face for the lie, the way a person checks a coin for the ring of false metal, turning it over, waiting for the tell. She didn't find one, or she didn't trust herself to have found one. Either way, after a long moment, her hands went still on the half-open laces, and she pulled the fabric closed again with fingers that were shaking now in a way they hadn't been a minute before. "You take the bed," he said, turning away to give her what privacy the small room allowed. "I'll sleep by the door. There's a bar for it if you want it dropped. I'd want it dropped in your place." He lay down on the hard floor in front of the hearth that night and listened to the fire settle and the wind howl, and after a long while the soft creak of the bed ropes as she finally lay down too. The iron bar never scraped into its brackets. He lay awake a long time wondering what that meant, and did not let himself hope it meant what he wanted it to. Morning came thin and gray, light leaking through the shutters like something apologizing for its own arrival. Nathaniel woke to the sound of scrubbing, not gentle but furious, frantic, the sound of someone trying to scour a debt off the surface of the world. Iris was on her knees at the hearth, working a wire brush across the stone hard enough to split her knuckles, blood beating dark against the gray ash. "Stop," he said. She flinched at the sound of his voice, but didn't stop. If anything, her hand moved faster, as if speed could outrun whatever punishment she'd already decided was coming. "I said stop, Iris." She dropped the brush like it had burned her, scrambled up and pressed her back to the log wall, eyes down, breath gone shallow and quick. She was waiting, he understood, for the reckoning. In whatever life had shaped her, working too hard and working wrong had both, apparently, been punishable offenses. He didn't know how to undo that kind of fear with words. He'd never been good with words, even when the person in front of him wasn't flinching from the sound of his voice like it was a raised hand. So he didn't use words. He filled a basin instead, warmed it at the stove, found a clean rag and a sliver of soap, and set a stool in the middle of the floor. "Sit," he said, and when she only stared at the stool like it might be a trap, he added, "Please." She sat, spine rigid, hands knotted white in her lap. He knelt in front of her without asking and reached for her foot, and she gasped and tried to pull back, but his grip was gentle and it held. He worked the worn boot free, and then the sock beneath it, threadbare and stiff with old blood, and what he found underneath made something hot and murderous rise up behind his ribs. Blisters gone raw, 2 toes blackened at the tips with frostbite that had almost, but not quite, taken hold for good. He said nothing about it. Rage wouldn't help her feet heal. He dipped the rag in warm water and began to clean them, slow and careful, his big scarred hands moving with a lightness that surprised even him. Iris sat above him, utterly rigid, watching the crown of his bowed head like she was waiting to understand the trick of it, because surely there was a trick. Surely a man did not kneel on a cold floor and tend a stranger's ruined feet for nothing. "My uncle sold me to pay a debt at the faro table," she said suddenly to the ceiling. To nobody, her voice flat as a table itself. 8 months ago. Before that it was. It doesn't matter. There's always a before that, isn't there? I stopped keeping count of the men. It felt like it made it smaller if I didn't count. Nathaniel's hands did not stop moving on her feet, though everything in him wanted to. He understood somehow that if he looked up at her now, she would stop talking, and this, whatever this was, this first crack in 8 months of silence, mattered too much to interrupt. "I don't know what you want from me," she went on, and her voice, for the first time, wavered. "Everyone wants something. I just want to know what it is so I can start." He finished with her feet before he answered. He worked a dab of bear grease and comfrose root into her cracked heels, wrapped them in clean strips of flannel, and only then did he sit back on his heels and look up at her properly. "I don't want anything from you, Iris," he said. "I bought you away from a man who was fixing to sell you again and again till there was nothing left to sell. That's the whole of it. Come spring thaw, you're free to ride down that mountain and never look back, and I won't say a word against it. Till then, you've got a roof and food, and nobody in this cabin is going to raise a hand to you. That's all I've got to offer. It isn't much." Something in her face moved then, not quite a crumbling, but a shift, like ice easing half an inch off a window pane. A tear slid down through the grime on her cheek, and then another, silent, her face still composed even as it leaked, like a dam with one hairline crack too many. "It's more than I've had in a long time," she whispered. He found her a pair of old boots, too big, lined with fleece, and set them at her feet. "Then put these on," he said, gruff again, because gruff was easier than whatever the alternative was. "And you can help me with the potatoes, but we don't scrub floors before there's coffee in the pot. House rule." For the first time since Larkspur Hollow, something that might have been the ghost of a laugh moved through her shoulders. Winter closed over the ridge, like a lid coming down on a jar. The days took on a shape neither of them had chosen, but both, in their separate silences, came to need. Iris learned the cabin's rhythms, where the good axe hung, which floorboard complained under weight. How Nathaniel liked his coffee black and bitter as regret. He learned hers, that she hummed low in her throat when her hands were busy and her mind was elsewhere, a habit she seemed unaware of and stopped, embarrassed of, whenever she caught herself. That she still flinched at sudden movement, but less each week. That she watched the door every night until the bar dropped into its bracket, though these days she dropped it herself without being told, and something in Nathaniel eased a little more each time she did. She told him things, in pieces, over weeks, the way a person empties a wound a little at a time, because emptying it all at once would kill them. That her mother had died of a fever when Iris was 9. That her father had been a decent man, a schoolteacher, until a logging accident took his arm, and not long after, the rest of him. That the uncle who inherited her, along with what little he'd left, had never once in 8 months called her by her given name. He told her things too, though it cost him more, words never having come easy to him even before 11 winters alone had rusted them shut entirely. That he'd had a wife once, Rebecca, and a daughter not yet 2, and a cabin in a valley 2 ranges over, and that a spring fever had taken them both inside the same terrible week while he was 3 days out on a trapping run and came home to 2 fresh graves he hadn't dug. That he'd come to this ridge afterward, because the wilderness didn't ask him to explain himself, and 11 years of silence had seemed, at the time, like the only mercy left available to him. "I'm sorry," Iris said, the first time he told her, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing that asked anything of him in return. "I'm sorry too," he said, meaning it for her, for the 8 months, for the uncle, for every man who'd ever called her quiet like it was a virtue instead of a wound. By the 2nd month she had filled out. Not much, food being scarce even for 2, but enough that her cheekbones softened, and her wrists no longer looked like they might snap under the weight of a coffee cup. The bruises faded from black to yellow to gone. She laughed sometimes, short surprised bursts of it, quickly smothered, as though laughing were a coin she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to spend. Nathaniel found himself splitting more firewood than the cabin needed, just for reasons to be near the window where he could watch her work, her dark hair coming loose from its braid, her hands sure now around a paring knife where once they'd shaken. It was, he thought sometimes, lying awake by the fire and listening to her breathe easy in the bed across the room, the first peace he'd known in 11 years. It felt, for that reason, unbearably fragile, the way all good things felt to a man who had already buried the last good thing he'd loved. He was right to be afraid of it. It broke on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the thaw was due. On a morning bright and hard and blue as broken glass, Ash screamed in the lean-to first, a high panicked sound that brought Nathaniel off the stool by the fire before his mind had caught up with his body. He was at the door with his hand on the frame when he saw them. 2 riders cresting the ridge trail, horses blowing steam, and even at that distance he knew the shape of the front one, the particular heavy slump of Garrison Tolliver's shoulders in the saddle. Beside him rode a leaner man Nathaniel didn't recognize, a rifle laid casual across his saddle horn, the way a man carries a thing he's fully prepared to use. "Stay inside," Nathaniel said low without turning. Behind him the door creaked. He turned to find Iris already there, wrapped in his old coat, her face gone full and still, and in a way he recognized now as the particular stillness she wore when the world had taught her once again that safety was only ever borrowed. "Well now," Garrison called out, reining in at the edge of the yard, tobacco juice staining a dark hole in the snow. "Cozy little arrangement. Fella throws that kind of cash around, we figured he might have a bit more charity in him. Or we just take back what's owed. Nothing's owed," Nathaniel said. "Turn around." The lean man, Boyd Nathaniel would learn, though it hardly mattered what to call a man in the moment, before he raised a rifle, levered around into the chamber, the sound sharp and final in the cold air. "Step aside," Boyd said. Nathaniel's revolver hung on a peg inside, 6 feet and a lifetime away. He had a skinning knife on his belt and nothing else, and he did the only thing a man in his position could do, which was move. Lunging forward through knee-deep snow, ducking under the panicked wheel of Garrison's horse to grab the rifle's hot barrel just as Boyd's finger found the trigger. The shot tore the morning open. Fire raked across Nathaniel's shoulder, and he heard himself grunt through it, twisting the barrel down and driving his knife into Boyd's thigh with the last of his momentum. Boyd shrieked and folded sideways off his horse. Garrison was already drawing, his own Colt swinging up level with Nathaniel's back as Nathaniel wrestled the rifle free. And Nathaniel understood, with the strange clear calm of a man who has already made peace with dying once before and finds the second time less frightening than expected, that he would not get his hands up in time. The second shot came from the porch. Garrison jerked, staring down at a ruin blooming dark across his coat, and folded backward into the snow with a heaviness that had nothing dramatic in it, only the plain, ugly fact of a body stopping. Nathaniel spun around. Iris stood on the top step with his revolver gripped in both hands, smoke curling off the barrel, her face white as the drifts around her, and her hands, remarkably, rock steady. Boyd, bleeding and cursing in the snow, took one look at Garrison and hauled himself onto his horse and fled back down the mountain trail without a backward glance. The silence after was enormous. Nathaniel pressed a hand to his shoulder, felt the hot, slick spread of blood through wool, and his knees went unreliable under him all at once, the adrenaline draining out and taking his strength with it. Iris was down the and across the yard before he'd fully registered moving, wedging her shoulder under his good arm with a strength he hadn't known she had. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice had gone flat again, but it was a different flatness than before, not the flatness of a woman disappearing inside herself, but the flatness of a person holding steady on purpose, because falling apart would cost someone else too much right now. "Graze," he managed. "Lean on me," she said, and it wasn't a request. She got him inside, got him onto the bed, tore his shirt open with hands that didn't shake even though her face had gone the color of the snow outside. She poured whiskey straight into the wound without flinching at his hiss of pain, packed it, bound it tight with strips of clean linen, her movements sure and economical in a way that told him this was not the first time she'd tended a wound, and that thought of what other wounds, whose in what other life, put a fresh ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the shoulder. "You didn't run," he said, when the worst of it was done and she sat back on the edge of the mattress with blood drying on her hands. "You had the horse. You had a clear road. You could have ridden down and never looked back, and I couldn't have stopped you." She looked at her red hands like she was seeing them for the first time, and then up at him, and something in her face had changed since Larkspur Hollow in a way that went beyond the healed bruises and the filled-out cheeks. The girl who had knelt on Garrison Tolliver's floor, doing arithmetic on how to survive the next 5 minutes, was not the woman looking at him now. "Where would I run to, Nathaniel?" she said, and there was the faintest cracked ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Who'd split the firewood? You'd let the whole cabin freeze feeling sorry for yourself." He laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him, the first one in longer than he could remember, and it hurt his shoulder and he didn't care. They buried Garrison Tolliver on the north slope where the ground was soft enough to dig despite the frost, and neither of them said a word over the grave, because neither of them had one worth saying. Boyd never came back up the mountain, and word came later, carried up with a supply train in early March, that he'd left the territory altogether rather than answer questions about a dead man and a missing girl and a debt nobody in Larkspur Hollow was in a hurry to collect on. The thaw came in April that year, late and grudging, snowmelt turning the trail to black mud and the creek behind the cabin to a running silver roar. Nathaniel remembered his promise. He led Ash around to the front of the cabin one clear cold morning, saddled and ready, and stood holding the reins without quite being able to make himself hold them out. Iris came to the door in the wool sweater she'd claimed as hers months back, her hair loose, her feet, healed now, whole now, bare on the cold boards, and looked at the horse and looked at him and did not move to take the reins. "You said come spring I could go," she said. "I did," he said, and it cost him everything he had to keep his voice even. "I meant it. Wherever you want, I'll see you get there safe." She was quiet a long moment, long enough that his heart had time to break clean in half and start reassembling itself into whatever smaller shape it would need to survive her leaving. "I don't want to go anywhere," Iris said finally. "I spent 8 months being somewhere I didn't want to be, with people who never once asked what I wanted. You're the first person who's asked, and what I want is to stay right here if you'll have me, not because I owe you, and not because I've got nowhere else, because I choose it, because somewhere between the trading post and now, this stopped being the place I was rescued to, and started being the place I live." Nathaniel stood there with the reins slack in his hand, and the whole wide unclaimed spring laid out around them, green just beginning to push up green through the black mud, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel since the 2 graves 2 ridges over. Not the absence of grief, because that never fully left a man, but room, finally, made alongside it for something else to grow. He led Ash back to the lean-to without a word, because some answers didn't need saying twice, and when he came back around the cabin, Iris was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and an eyebrow raised, waiting, the ghost of the frightened girl from Larkspur Hollow nowhere in her face at all. "Well," she said, "are you going to stand there all day? Or is somebody going to help me get this garden started before the ground freezes again?" He crossed the yard to her, and for the first time since Rebecca, since the fever, since 11 years of silence he'd told himself he preferred, he reached out and let his hand rest against a woman's cheek, without flinching from what it might cost him to want something again. She didn't flinch either. She turned her face into his palm and closed her eyes. And up on that ridge, with the whole mountain thawing loud and green around them, 2 people who had both been taught in their separate ways that safety was a thing you couldn't trust, let themselves believe it anyway.